Hello everyone, we are now at module 14, which is the peace process with the Bangsamoro fronts. For this module, for this topic, we should be able to answer the following questions. Number one, what are the major developments in the peace process between the government and the Bangsamoro Liberation Fronts? And number two, what are the challenges that confront the above peace process? Number three, what are the safeguard features to the current GPH MILF peace process? And the last one is, what implications does the peace process have on the national development? In the previous lesson, we learned that Bangsamoro aspiration for self-determination eventually culminated in an armed struggle for secession from the Philippine state. Along with the communist insurgency, Bangsamoro secessionism became one of the most serious internal threats to the Philippine Republic. So serious, in fact, that it threatened to disintegrate Philippine territory if it succeeded. Of course, the reaction from the Philippine government under Marcos was brute force. Through Presidential Decree 1081, Marcos placed the entire Philippines under martial law and therefore militarized the entire country. Among the most militarized was the predominantly more areas of Mindanao. This was pointed out by the Senator Alberto Romulo in his privileged speech. 61% of our army and marine battalions, more than 40% of our artillery capability, 50% of our armor assets, 63% of our tactical aircraft were committed to the Mindanao conflict. Yet, despite the heavy militarization, the rebellion did not disappear. Militarization seemed to even intensify. This goes to show that a military approach is not the solution to the problem. Because of this, even the Philippine government under Marcos thought it was prudent to sit down and negotiate with the Moro rebels. The Moro rebels must have shared the same thought as Salah Jubair expressed. War is always costly while negotiation is cheap. A day in war is usually costlier than a month of talking. In negotiation, there are no lives lost, properties destroyed, or people rendered homeless. The above is corroborated by the statement of the Vice Chair of the Government Peace Panel, Rudy Rodelo said, "For the issue of armed rebellion, it seems best for the government to hold formal peace talks with the organized rebel groups. Measured in money terms, this process now called peace process is without question less costly than war. Measured in moral and other social standards, resolving conflict among our citizens through peaceful means will build our character as a nation on solid moral grounds. Or put in another way, it will reveal how profoundly we value human lives. Are we a nation of warmongers or a nation of peacemakers?" So, what were the major developments in the peace process between the government and the Bangsamoro Liberation Fronts? In general terms, a peace process refers to any social and or political process in which conflicts are resolved through peaceful means. It is a process that combines politics, diplomacy, mediation, negotiation, dialogue, and changing relationships. Its objective is not only to stop war or manage an ongoing violence. Rather, it is aimed at addressing the root causes of conflict through dialogue, compromise, and positive action. In this way, a peace process is aimed at creating a more conducive environment for human beings to achieve their full potentials and transform relationships from belligerence to friendship. Because it is a process and usually involving gnarly and delicate issues, it is often lengthy and full of challenges. This is what characterized by the peace process between the Philippine government and the two Bangsamoro Liberation Fronts. Since 1975, we have two peace processes. One was with the Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF, and the second was the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF. Each of these took a huge amount of time and each never proceeded without serious challenges, and nonetheless they appear as valuable lessons. The GRP MNLF Peace Process, 1975 to 1966. The GRP MNLF peace process started with the involvement of the Organization of Islamic Countries, a powerful and influential bloc composed of Muslim countries. Apparently, the OIC noticed the plight of the Muslims in the southern Philippines that they included the Bangsamoro issue in their agenda during the February 29, 1972 meeting. After several rounds of shuttle mediation, the OIC succeeded in bringing the GRP and MNLF together to sit in the negotiating table on January 18 to 19, 1975 in Saudi Arabia. It is interesting to note that the original demand of the MNLF was independence. So, yun lang yung demand ng MNLF para sa gobyerno, yung independence lang. But because of the OIC was only willing to support autonomy within the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Republic of the Philippines, the MNLF was forced to drop independence in exchange for a strong autonomous region with internal security forces. We do not exactly know why the OIC did not favor the MNLF struggle for independence, but we can speculate that OIC, being conservative governments themselves, would not also allow any group to secede and dismember any part of their respective countries if, for example, it happens to them. Anyhow, the negotiations proceeded with autonomy as the center of the discussions, until finally on December 23, 1976, the GRP and MNLF in the presence of representatives from the OIC signed the Tripoli Agreement. The 1976 Tripoli Agreement was supposed to establish autonomy to the 13 Mindanao provinces, namely Zamboanga del Sur, Zamboanga del Norte, Sulu, Tawi-Tawi, Basilan, Davao del Sur, South Cotabato, North Cotabato, Maguindanao, Sultan Kudarat, Lanao del Sur, Lanao del Norte, and Palawan, and 9 cities therein, namely Cotabato, Dapitan, Dipolog, General Santos, Iligan, Marawi, Pagadian, Zamboanga, and Puerto Princesa. However, because the Tripoli Agreement was so lacking in details, with many of its provisions left to later discussions, it became very contentious. As it turned out, succeeding talks held in Libya and in Manila to discuss details in the provisions eventually led to the bogging down and collapse of the peace talks. On the whole, GRP and MNLF panels says could not agree on their degree of autonomy to be handed down to the Moros and definite role the MNLF had to play in it. Soon, in the later part of 1977, sporadic clashes broke out between government and MNLF forces. The MNLF accused government troops of continuing military operations against MNLF communities despite the ceasefire agreement. The sporadic fighting plus the deadlocks which characterized all attempts at moving forward with the peace process between 1977 and early 1980 led the MNLF to revert to independence. Nur Miswari announced this in a press conference held in London on April 17, 1980. With the apparent collapse of the peace talks, Marcos unilaterally implemented the creation of the regional autonomous governments or RAGs of Region 9 and 12. Whether or not this was made to project an image that his government did its part in implementing the 1977 Tripoli Agreement is uncertain. What is certain, however, was that while these regions are called autonomous, they are such in name only. In reality, they are nothing but administrative regions, no different from the other regular regions of the Philippines. Anyhow, 6 years after the MNLF reverted to independence, Marcos was toppled down through the People Power Revolution of 1986. Alam na natin anong nangyari sa People Power Revolution noong 1986. A new government under Cory Aquino took over and manifested its interest to revive the peace process with the Moro rebels. The OIC also took interest in sponsoring a new series of peace talks between the Moro rebels and the new government. It even asked the MNLF and the MILF, a faction led by the MNLF Vice Chair Salamat Hashim, who broke away from Nur Miswari due to leadership and other issues in 1977, to unite so that there is only one voice for the Bangsamoro. But the consolidated unification did not materialize because allegedly Cory Aquino broke protocols by visiting Normiswari ahead before the MILF and MNLF could settle their differences. Furthermore, the initial cordial relationship between the Cory Aquino government and that of the MNLF was never sustained as later events tarnished the GRP-MNLF relationship. Rudy Rodel observed this. The government without official MNLF participation went into full implementation of the new constitution, which contains specific provisions on how to put it in place, the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao. The president created the Regional Consultative Commission, which helped the draft of the Organic Act for Muslim Mindanao. Based on this draft, Congress enacted Republic Act 6734 after the plebiscite of November 1989. The autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao was in place, but as far as the MNLF and the OIC are concerned, the Tripoli Agreement had yet to be implemented. Because of the unilateral moves of the Cory Aquino administration, the MNLF continued to fight the government. Another opportunity was lost to win the rebels back to the government fold. When Fidel Ramos became president, the first move that he did was to revive the peace process with the MNLF. He organized a team to conduct exploratory talks with the rebel groups starting 1992. Ramos proved to be more tactful in his dealing with the MNLF, so that on September 2, 1996, 20 years after the signing of the Tripoli Agreement, the GRP and MNLF signed a final peace agreement. The 1996 FPA had two phases. Phase 1 covers a 3-year transitional period intended to enable the MNLF to settle down and reestablish themselves back to their normal lives. And Phase 2 entails the enactment of an amended Organic Act that will establish a new autonomous government and the expansion of its territory based on the results of the plebiscite. As part of the agreement, the territories enumerated in the original 1976 Tripoli Agreement were designated as Special Zone of Peace and Development, which was to become an area of focus and intensified peace and development efforts. To coordinate, promote, and accelerate the peace and development efforts in the SZOPAD, or the Special Zone of Peace and Development, a Southern Philippines Council for Peace and Development was created. Normiswari was to serve as its chairperson, while the governors and vice governors and the 9 city mayors of the SZOPAD were to become members of the council. Part of the agreement also was the integration of MNLF combatants into the armed forces of the Philippines and Philippine National Police. How challenging the implementation was of the 1996 FPA between the government and the MNLF was described to us by Rodil. Sabi niya, the integration process took more time than agreed upon, but the first quarter of 2003, the entire process was completed. The legislative process for the amendment of the Organic Act took more time, almost 3 years, than was prescribed in the agreement. The plebiscite was finally held on August 14, 2001. Only the province of Basilan and the city of Marawi opted to be added to the territory of the autonomous region. Despite the delays, things seemed to go well. Normiswari was even elected as ARMM governor, and the MNLF communities were dubbed as peace and development communities, whose residents became recipients of peace and development projects for the government and various donors. GRP or GPH-MNLF peace process. Inspired by the success of the signing of the 1966 final peace agreement with the MNLF, Ramos made initiatives to revive the peace negotiation with the MNLF. So, hindi lang yung MNLF yung gustong anong tawag dyan, usapang pangkapayapaan, kundi yung MILF din. Exploratory talks began with a series of one-on-one meetings between Executive Secretary Ruben Torres and MILF Vice Chair for Political Affairs Ghazali Jafar. During these meetings, Torres and Jafar discussed the general mechanism on how to approach the formal talks. As soon as they were able to agree that each side would have a main negotiating panel assisted by an 11-man technical committee which shall be split into committee for agenda setting and committee for the cessation of hostilities. The formal peace talks began on January 7, 1997 at Cruising Simuay, Sultan Kudarat, Maguindanao. At the outset, the mood was very positive. In a joint press statement released after the meeting, the two parties considered the event historic and a step forward for the attainment of a just and lasting peace in Mindanao. But the positive mood later on changed. President Ramos' term ended in 1998, and his successor Joseph Estrada seemed to adopt the opposite approach. As succeeding events showed, armed encounters between government soldiers and MLF combatants spoiled the talks. Skirmishes quickly turned ugly until it developed into what well known as the 2000 All-Out War. From March to July 2000, the armed forces of the Philippines overran all MLF camps, including the main and biggest camp, Abu Bakar. With the superior firepower of the government, the MILF simply abandoned their camps and resorted to the guerrilla warfare. In other words, the all-out war of President Estrada did not end the rebellion. Despite the disruptions, the peace process continued. In March 2001, the presidential advisor of the peace process, Eduardo Ermita, and Haj Murad Ibrahim, then chair of the MLF panel, signed a document that officially resumed the suspended peace talks. The said document stipulated that both parties will honor, respect, and implement all past agreements and other and supplementary agreements signed by them. Furthermore, they signed another document on June 22, 2001 in Tripoli, Libya, where they decided to focus the agenda of the talks of three aspects, namely security, rehabilitation, and ancestral domain. It was very important that both parties should tackle first security, as this was a requisite for rehabilitation and other topics in the peace talks. They needed to install security mechanisms to minimize disruptions of the peace negotiation by misencounters that could easily develop into major wars. Note that the minor and major violence between 1997 and 2000 were caused, among the others, by the absence of rules to be observed by combatants of both sides. So as to prevent the repetition of mistakes, both parties signed the implementing guidelines on security aspects on August 7, 2001. Through this, the government and the MLF agreed to desist from the committing private hostile and provocative acts, coordinate their respective movements to prevent misencounters, stop hostilities to allow the conduct of inquiry on incidents of the GRP MLF Coordinating Committee on Cessation of Hostiles or CCCH, and guarantee the security of the negotiating panels as well as that of the members of the CCCH. Also, a local monitoring team or LMT was created to monitor the ceasefire arrangement at the provincial level. What is interesting about the LMT is that it is institutionalized the participation of the local people in the peace process, as its members were obtained from representatives of the local government unit, local political committee of the MLF, and non-governmental organizations or NGO, and the religious sector within the area. Because both sides are convinced that the activities of criminal groups impede the peace process, they agreed to isolate and interdict them by creating the Ad Hoc Joint Action Group or AHJAG in 2002, whose composition is made up of PNP, AFP, and MILF elements, and whose task is to carry out the arrest and neutralization of criminals operating or taking refuge in or near MILF areas. Indeed, the AHGAG was a kind of confidence-building measure to promote goodwill and cooperating between government and MILF combatants who used to fight each other in the past. Yet, despite this development, violence broke out again in 2003. So, ayun, nag-encounter na naman yung MLF at yung Armed Forces of the Philippines. And when the military launched a major campaign at the MLF headquarters in Bulyok Complex in the Liguasian Marsh. The military accused the MLF of trying to take back the camps which government forces overran during the 2000 all-out war. The MLF, on the other hand, made counter-accusations by saying that it was the soldiers who harassed them first. This series of violence split over to the other parts of the Central Mindanao and reaching as far as Lanao del Norte. As a consequence, some 37,000 civilians were displaced. In their continued effort to look for creative ways improving the security aspect of the peace process, the GRP and the MILF thought it prudent to have an objective third party not only to monitor the implementation of the security guideline but also to serve as an objective referee between the two parties in case hostilities break out. Thus, in the 2004, the GRP and MILF crafted the terms of the reference for the International Monitoring Team or IMT, whose task is to monitor the overall implementation of the security guidelines and the ceasefire agreement. The first team was deployed in 2004, which included members from Malaysia, Brunei, Japan, and Libya. Things seemed to be going well from 2004 up to the first half of 2008 when information leaked about the secret signing of Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain or MOAAD. Remember that along with security and rehabilitation, Ancestral Domain was one of the foci of the GRP MILF talks. The said document was supposed to be signed on August 5, 2008, but because the Philippine Supreme Court issued a temporary restraining order or TRO a day before its supposed signing, the MOAAD did not materialize. The leaked information about the MOAAD and the TRO issued by the Supreme Court created a lot of commotions. First, the predominantly Christian areas of Iligan North, Cotabato, and Zamboanga organized public protests against a document where they perceived to be affecting their lives without their knowledge. Then, local MLF commanders such as Bravo and Umbra Cato launched violent attacks against Christian communities in northern Cotabato and Lanao del Norte. As a response, the AFP launched military operations against the two commanders. All in all, more than 600,000 Muslim and Christian civilians were displaced in the two provinces as a result of Hulubalu. Then, ultimately, the Philippine Supreme Court declared the MOAD unconstitutional on October 14, 2008. And Monica will continue the rest of the topic.